Personality psychology is a large and diverse field of psychology that addresses many important questions. This includes things like, how does your personality relate to outcomes in the workplace and in relationships? Where does your personality come from? How much of it is based in genetics? How much of it is based in socialization or some combination of the two? And what kinds of important outcomes in terms of health and even longevity does your personality predict? In this module, we're going to be talking about 4 of the many questions that personality psychologists study to give you a basis and an introduction for knowing what are the big questions in personality psychology. The 4 questions we're going to talk about today are 1. Where do personality traits come from? 2. What are the neural and psychological bases of personality traits? 3. Can personality traits change? And 4. What important outcomes are associated with different traits? First, where do personality traits come from? There are a lot of ways of addressing this question, where do they come from? In the broadest sense, we could ask from an evolutionary perspective, are personality traits, and is a personality something that just humans have, or do other animals have personalities too? Now, when we look at other animals, we often think that we see that they have personalities. We might think that different species have different personalities from each other. We might also think that within a given species, different animals have different personalities. Some dogs may be more dominant, more submissive. Some dogs may be more friendly or not friendly, etc. Now, for a long time, psychologists didn't really know whether this was a product of the animal's actual behavior or whether this was just something that people would see in the animals. There are lots of examples in popular culture of people looking at animals and thinking that they see things that maybe don't have anything to do with the animal's actual behavior. The grumpy cat meme, which is popular on the internet, is an example of a cat that has fur that's shaped like a frown and everybody thinks it looks like the cat is frowning. However, when psychologists have studied actual animal behavior and measured it, what they found is that there really are individual differences in behavior within different species, suggesting that there really are personality traits in different species. So, for example, some dogs are consistently very dominant and other dogs are consistently very submissive, and so we could say that dominance and submissiveness is a characteristic trait that varies among dogs. And in fact, dominance is a trait that varies among a lot of different species, a lot of different social animals. However, there are some other traits that seem to be relatively unusual in the animal kingdom and maybe even unique to human beings. So in the Big Five, traits related to openness to experience, for example, those may be things that other animals have, but we haven't yet observed a whole lot of evidence that other animals vary in how open or conservative they are. Now, the evolutionary approach is one way of asking where do personality traits come from. And the fact that other animals have personality traits too suggests that maybe there's something biological about them. In human beings, twin and adoption studies are one method that psychologists have used to try to study where personality traits come from. The idea here is that twins are people who are raised together but 100% identical. Adopted siblings are raised together, but genetically they're no more similar than 2 strangers. And so we can study how much the family environment makes people similar or different, as well as how much the genetic relatedness makes people similar or different. From these kinds of studies, what researchers have found is that it really seems to be a mix of different influences. Twin adoption studies suggest that about half of the variability in personality traits is related to variability in genes. The other half is related to variability in environments that people experience. And out of those environments, the biggest portion of it is what psychologists call non-shared environment. That means things in the environment that would affect different people in different ways. So for example, 2 different twins, even though they're raised in the same family, they might have different experiences or they might interpret events in different ways that would make them different from each other. That's the non-shared environment, and that seems to matter a lot too. Another way of asking where does personality come from is looking over the course of a single lifespan or a collection of single lifespans. One of the most famous studies of lifespan development of personality is the Avshalom Caspi et al. Study of temperament done in Dunedin, New Zealand, also known as the Dunedin study. For the Dunedin study, the researchers recruited every child born in Dunedin, New Zealand in 1972. So they approached families who had children and asked them if they would be willing to be in this study. Dunedin, in case you're not familiar with it, is a medium-sized town in New Zealand. Its current population is about 130,000, so it's a little bit smaller than Eugene, Oregon. Out of every child who was born in Dunedin and who was approached, a little over 1,000 participated through the consent of their parents. And for this study, the children were assessed at birth as well as followed up every 2 to 3 years. This was a broad study designed to look at public health, but it included assessments of personality and temperament. Temperament being what developmental psychologists refer to when we refer to personality in adults. It's more or less the same thing. For this study, or for the set of results I'm going to show you, the key assessment was at age 3. At age 3, all the children participated in a 90-minute behavioral testing session where they did a number of different kinds of tasks designed to measure their temperament. These were tasks designed to measure things like how did they respond to being alone with a stranger for a very brief period of time, how did they respond to disappointment and frustration, how did they respond to enjoyable experiences, and so forth. Now, based on these assessments at age 3, the researchers grouped the children into 3 categories. The first of these categories were what they called well-adjusted children. These were children who, across this behavioral testing session, showed that they were capable of self-control when needed, relatively self-confident, and did not show unusual fear of new people or situations. Now, for a 3-year-old, of course, some amount of fear would be considered normal, but they didn't show an extreme amount. Another group, which the researchers called under-controlled, were children who, in these behavioral testing sessions, were impulsive, restless, distractible, and emotionally reactive. And then finally, a third group was called the inhibited group. These were children who were shy, who are especially fearful, more than is considered normal for this age range, and who are very easily upset through interactions with strangers. Now, these categories were created based, as I said, on a 90-minute testing session at age 3. And the question that Caspi et al. Had was, were these categories saying something just about what these kids happened to be like that day when they came into these assessment sessions, or were these tapping into something relatively enduring about these children's personalities that might show up later on in their lives? Now remember, this was a longitudinal study, meaning that the children came in every 3 years, and in fact, many of the participants continued to come in until they were adults. And so the researchers were able to see, based on how these children were classified from 90 minutes of behavior at age 3, what were they like as older children and what were they like as adults. And the answer is that there was a fair amount of consistency in these children's personality. So later in childhood, the children who at age 3 were classified as under-controlled, when they got to school, they were more likely to have what are called externalizing problems. These were problems with fighting, lying, disobeying teachers, and that sort of thing. Conversely, the children who were classified as inhibited were more likely to have internalizing problems. They were more likely to worry excessively, to cry easily at problems, and so forth. Even more strikingly, in adulthood, the children who were placed in these different categories had different personalities. The age 3 types predicted adult personality in a consistent way. Now, these were not 100% predictive, not by any means. These age 3 types were not children's locked-in destiny. But the researchers did find that if a child was, let's say, inhibited at age 3, they were more likely to be shy and nervous as an adult than children from the other 2 categories. And interestingly, these age 3 types didn't just predict adult personality, they also predicted a number of important outcomes. So well-adjusted children were more likely to be employed than the other groups. Under-controlled children were more likely to have criminal history. And children who are either under-controlled or inhibited were more likely to have different kinds of psychiatric disorders than the well-adjusted children. Again, these are not perfect predictions. Lots of kids who were inhibited or under-controlled turned out pretty well, and some of the kids who were well-adjusted had problems too. But overall, you found more kids from the different groups having different outcomes than you would expect if the age 3 assessment had been just pure random chance, suggesting that there really is some continuity in personality. Okay, moving on to the second question. What are the neural and psychological bases of personality traits? So I've already given you some hints based on the behavior genetic literature, that we can infer from similarities among twins and from dissimilarities among adopted siblings, there's something genetic going on that has to do with personality. But can we find a little bit more specifically what's happening? Well, in one study that I'll show you a slide from, Colin DeYoung and colleagues, a researcher at the University of Minnesota, did brain scans of different people and looked at whether the size of different regions of the brain was correlated with people's personalities. So this was a correlational study in adults, but this was looking at the physical size of these different structures. And what they found was that different personality traits among the big five were correlated with the sizes of different regions of the brain. So for example, extroversion was correlated with the size of the medial orbitofrontal cortex. This is a part of the brain that's involved in impulsivity and self-control. So that is some evidence that there's some kind of an association between personality and brain structures. But of course, on some level, we would expect that there would have to be some kind of correlation between personality and the brain, because everything about our behavior involves the brain. So there have to be some kind of differences. Can we understand a little bit more about the processes or mechanisms? Well, one really important approach that a lot of people have taken is to try to identify what is the core underlying psychological process at the heart of each personality trait. And for this module today, I'm going to focus on extroversion as an example, because that's probably where the most work has been done. So if you recall from earlier modules, the big five came from an analysis of lots and lots of different traits, and all of the big five factors are collections of many specific traits. So when we talk about extroversion in the Big Five model, extroverts have a number of different traits. They're more outgoing, they're more sociable, they're more friendly, they're also more assertive, they're more talkative, they experience more positive emotions. And a question researchers have had is there one underlying process, is there one thing that all these things have in common that might explain why they go together and why extroverts are extroverted and introverts are not? One early theory of this was from a researcher named Hans Eysenck. Eysenck had a very interesting, though somewhat speculative theory called optimal arousal theory. And the idea was this: Eysenck thought that everyone has an optimal level of arousal. Everyone's brain, everyone's body has an ideal level that it should be aroused. And Eysenck hypothesized that maybe the reason extroverts act extroverted, maybe the reason they're outgoing and sociable and assertive, is because their brains are typically below their optimal arousal level. And so they go around acting outgoing and extroverted in order to get stimulation to arouse their brains, because if they didn't, their brains would sink below an optimal arousal level. Eysenck postulated that this might take place in an area of the brain called the reticular activating system, and he had some interesting, though somewhat speculative evidence suggesting this might be the case, but it really hasn't received a whole lot of empirical support since then. But this was one historically early attempt to try to understand a kind of a core process. More recently, there have been two major explanations that have been put forward for what extroversion is really about. The first of these is the reward sensitivity theory. Now, we know from previous research that the brain has different systems, different networks associated with approach behaviors and inhibition behaviors. So there's a system in the brain associated with approaching things, with moving towards positive things, moving towards rewards. And there's a system in the brain associated with inhibiting behavior when things are dangerous or negative. These systems are activated by potentially rewarding or potentially threatening stimuli. And there's some growing evidence suggesting that extroversion is associated with how sensitive the approach system is to rewards. So in other words, when there are rewards present in the environment, the more extroverted somebody is, the more likely they are to notice and respond to those rewards. And the less extroverted or more introverted someone is, the more likely they are to be a little bit less reactive to them. Introverts are not insensitive completely to rewards, they're just a little less sensitive than extroverts. And so this is one of those theories. Another theory is the social attention theory. Here, this is based on research showing that social activities are rewarding for a lot of people. People enjoy spending time with others, and pretty much everybody enjoys spending time with others more than they enjoy being completely alone. From an evolutionary perspective, getting others' attention can have benefits. We know from other research that getting people's attention is a way to gain influence over others. It's a way to attract mates and friends. And research shows that extroverts gain and hold other people's attention more than introverts do. And so this is another theory, another core process theory, suggesting that the core process at the heart of extroversion is a tendency to seek out social attention. Okay, moving on. Can personality traits change? This question is one of the oldest questions in personality psychology. In some ways, the definition of personality assumes that we're talking about something that's at least somewhat stable. But the question is, can your personality change at all? Especially once you're an adult, your body has stopped developing. Does your personality stop developing as well? Now, early researchers Jeff McCrea and Paul Costa, early in the history of the field, claimed that personality becomes essentially set like plaster in early adulthood. Their hypothesis was that the maturation of personality follows a similar trajectory to the maturation of, let's say, your height and other aspects of your body, that they change a lot when you're a child and when you're in adolescence, but the rate of change slows down, and by the time you reach about age 30, your personality is pretty much where it's going to be for most of the rest of your life, at least until old age, when things like dementia and other physical changes start setting in. I was one of the researchers back in the late 90s and early 2000s who was interested in testing whether this was true. And so I'm going to present to you some of my own research as well as talk about some of the other research that people have done. For the study that I did on this, we were interested in knowing whether it becomes set like plaster. And so we surveyed 132,000 internet users about their personalities. These were people who came to a website and filled out a questionnaire and in exchange got personality feedback. The focus of this study was on typical or average change. So are there normative or average increases or decreases in some traits? Now, if McCrea and Costa's theory was true, then what we should have seen was that after age 30, the average 30-year-old, the average 40-year-old, the average 50-year-old shouldn't be different from one another. There may be individual differences, but average personality should stop changing. However, what we found was something quite different. So here is a figure showing our results for the Big Five trait of conscientiousness. What we found was that conscientiousness increases in adulthood. It increases a lot during the 20s, but it continues to increase in the 30s, 40s, and 50s. So people become more responsible, more orderly, more industrious, pretty much throughout adulthood. We looked all the way up to age 60. And this was true of men as well as of women. Another trait that we looked at was the Big Five trait of agreeableness. Here we found something that not only showed that personality was changing after 30, but that it was changing more after 30 than it was before 30. So what we found was that prior to age 30, in other words, through people's 20s, there wasn't a whole lot of change in agreeableness, but that after age 30, the average personality becomes much more agreeableness. And agreeableness includes things like being warm and nurturing and supportive of others. Another trait, the Big Five trait of neuroticism, we found different patterns for men and women. Now, previous research has documented that there is a gender difference in early adulthood in this trait. Men are more emotionally stable, women are more vulnerable to things like depression, and that's consistent from the clinical literature as well. Here what we found was that men's neuroticism wasn't changing all that much across adulthood from 21 to 60, but that women were decreasing in neuroticism. They were becoming more emotionally stable. And this kind of fits in a nice way with some research from adolescents showing that this gender difference emerges around puberty, suggesting that early in childhood and in later in adulthood, there's not much of a gender difference. This is something that's really distinct to young and middle adulthood. Subsequent studies have replicated these findings, studies with different designs, including longitudinal studies that have followed people for long periods of time. And so this work really, I think, set aside that notion that the average personality becomes set like plaster and doesn't change. Now, the next really important question that the field has been working on is, why does personality change? And right now, researchers are actively working on this question, including my own lab, and there are a number of different possibilities. One is that as people get older, their values and priorities change, and so their personalities change to become consistent with them. For example, people might become less materialistic and more outward-looking in their values, and so they might become more pro-social in their personalities as well. Another possibility is that social roles and environments are affecting personality change. So we know that people go through a lot of role transitions. You remember the first figure I showed you was for conscientiousness. People become more responsible and industrious. And we know that people's social roles tend to push them towards that on average through adulthood. People take on more responsibilities in the workplace. People take on more responsibilities with families, raising children. And so that may be promoting personality change. A third possibility is biological maturation. Maybe just like we're biologically programmed to grow taller during childhood, maybe these trait changes are something that's biologically programmed in adulthood and would happen regardless of what kind of social roles or values people have. And that's something that the field is actively investigating. And once we figure out why personality changes, I think the really big question is, can we intervene to change it? Are there things that we can do to help people change their personalities if they want to change? Lots of us would like to become more conscientious, more emotionally stable, and I think that's going to be the next frontier in personality psychology in the coming decades. Okay, last question. What important outcomes are associated with different traits? So we know that personality traits have this biological basis. We know that they can change over the life course, although they're also relatively stable. So there's a combination of stability and change. And question number 4 is, what are important outcomes? If we know what your personality is, can we make any predictions? Can we form any expectations about what's going to happen? And the answer is yes. There's a lot of evidence suggesting that personality traits are associated with important outcomes. Now, these aren't deterministic. It's not the case that if we know your personality now that we know exactly what's going to happen to you in the future. These are correlations, but they do suggest that personality is somehow related to and perhaps causing some of these outcomes. So for example, extroverts are less likely to become depressed. They're more likely to be accepted by peers. They date a larger variety of people. They're more likely to be involved in volunteerism and leadership. People who are high in agreeableness, that's people who are warm and trusting and so forth, they're less likely to have heart disease, they're more accepted by their peers, they have more satisfying romantic lives, they're less likely to become criminals, and so on. I want to focus on one of these because it's in some ways the ultimate outcome, the most important one that many of us care about, and that is predicting health and length of life. And I want to give you just a little bit of a more in-depth look to show you how the Big Five trait of conscientiousness is associated with health and length of life. So as I said before, these predictions are probabilities, not deterministic. But what you can see from this figure, this is from a study that was done of conscientiousness and lifespan development and mortality. What this study found was that the probability of living longer, how much longer somebody would live, was related to their childhood conscientiousness. And that the effect of being high versus low in conscientiousness was about similar in size to the effect of the gender difference. So we all know that women live longer than men, and it's also the case that conscientious people live longer than less conscientious people. So if you take a look here, this red line that I just popped in at age 70, you can see what's the probability that someone who's male or female, high or low in conscientiousness, will live to age 70. And so this first horizontal line that I popped in, that's for males who are low in conscientiousness. That comes in about 68%. For males who are high in conscientiousness, about 73% will live to 70. For females who are low in conscientiousness, about 77%. And for females who are high in conscientiousness, about 80%. So conscientiousness really does matter. Now, this is just a correlation. This doesn't tell us anything about mechanism. You might be wondering, well, why do conscientious people live longer? And there are a number of supporting lines of evidence. One is what we call social factors. So conscientiousness is correlated with a lot of things that we know are related to living longer. Conscientious people have greater career success and earnings. They have more stable marriages. They have greater social capital, meaning that they have more robust social networks. They're more involved in their community and religious groups. All these things are known to be protective factors in living longer. We also know that conscientiousness is associated with a number of health behaviors. So conscientious people are less likely to use tobacco, less likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, less likely to use alcohol and drugs, less likely to drive in a risky way, less likely to be perpetrators or victims of violence. And so this suggests that there are probably many different ways that conscientious people live longer. They're less likely to have accidents. They're less likely to get to be involved in violence. They're less likely to have early onset of chronic diseases. Okay, that concludes our module looking at personality traits, 4 important questions.